This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a series of academic books about animal studies. You should take a look through the list and consider asking your library to order any that look interesting to you. The series published multiple books in 2024 and, in fact, we're going to be talking about one of them today. And that's because I'm very pleased to introduce you to a returning guest, someone who first appeared on Knowing Animals nearly 9 years ago in February 2016. Dr. Richard Twine is a reader of sociology at Edge Hill University in the United Kingdom. He'll be well known to lots of regular listeners of this podcast for the work he's done championing the discipline of critical animal studies. His books include 2010's Animals as Biotechnology, which I've seen described as the first book entirely devoted to critical animal studies, and the 2014 collection The Rise of Critical Animal Studies, which was co-edited with Nick Taylor. Today, however, we're going to talk about his 2024 Sydney University Press book, The Climate Crisis and Other Animals, published as part of the Animal Politics book series. Welcome to the podcast, Richard.
Thanks, Josh.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to write this book?
Sure, it was quite a long run-up, actually, probably, I would say 10 years, actually. There was an original plan, or an original idea between Matthew Calarco and I to write a book on climate. And I don't know, we just got too busy and we that didn't come off. And then I still wanted to do it. And, I was getting interested in understanding sociological theories of plant-based transition. I was always also kind of defined myself as an environmental sociologist as well. So it just seemed that was taking me on that path to write a book about the climate crisis. And also there was for me, there was an obvious gap as well. There was not only a gap within animal studies or critical animal studies, there was a gap within the social sciences, really. And I wanted to write a book that was going to try to problematize the kind of sort of unreflected upon anthropocentrism, which is present in a lot of kind of mooted solutions to the climate crisis. It seems like we keep reinventing concepts, or we keep coming up with concepts that just reproduce a kind of human-centered approach, whether that's climate justice or sustainability. They don't take that reflective step back and think about other species.
A lot of these concepts, a lot of these disciplines, a lot of these activist ideas reproduce anthropocentrism. They overlook animals in the climate crisis. So let's start with that, if you like, empirical question. Where are animals in the climate crisis? What is it that's being overlooked here?
It's not just that they reproduce anthropocentrism in its narrow sense of reproducing human-centeredness. It's also in that broader sense of the concept of anthropocentrism put forward, within critical animal work by people such as Matthew Calarco, his sort of definitional work around that. We define anthropocentrism in a much broader ideological sense, and it's also kind of relates to how we exclude not just non-human animals, but humans identified with animality and so on. So it's a little bit more complicated than just excluding animals. It's also about excluding a particular notion that the way we treat animals is also linked in with how we treat human beings as well, in a kind of intersectional understanding which critical animal studies tends to favor. In terms of where animals are in the climate crisis, it's within the emergence of the climate crisis in terms of the radical land use changes in the unfolding development of capitalism and the direct emissions from certain types of animal agriculture as well. That always needs to be acknowledged in terms of the role of human-animal relations in producing the climate crisis. Secondly, obviously in the effects of the climate crisis, and sometimes there's a tendency to maybe exclude a consideration of the way in which the climate crisis is already very much affecting millions, actually billions of non-human animals. And so that reminds us that, we're very much living within the crisis. It's not some future event. So human-animal relations are there in the emergences of the climate crisis. They're there in the unfolding effects of the climate crisis. And thirdly, the third aspect of that really is in terms of the potential strategies for combating the climate crisis, human-animal relations, which I say in the book are not a panacea, but they're certainly part of the strategy that we should be looking at in terms of how do we get out of this complete mess that modernity has found itself in. And the argument, obviously, in the book is the transformation of human-animal relations in terms of the transformation of the food system, other aspects of transformation of human-animal relations as well, being one important strategy. When we recognize that agriculture contributes over a third of all emissions, and within that, it's over 50% of those emissions are argued to be from animal agriculture. So up to about 20% perhaps in total attributed to animal agriculture. But I also cover that debate in the book as well in terms of the long, complex debate over what is the contribution of animal ag to emissions.
Much of what you're talking about here is familiar, or perhaps I should say hopefully familiar, from climate science, from empirical physical science. What do you think is the role of sociology, which is your home discipline, in this conversation?
The book certainly includes an argument for the role of sociology, but not just sociology. So, I'm also arguing for the importance of historical perspectives and the critical thinking that we find within philosophy. And, I also spend a whole chapter basically championing conservation science because they've done the work over the last few decades has specified the impacts of climate change on other species. So this isn't a book just for sociologists. It's an argument for interdisciplinarity. Having said that, there are certainly characteristics of sociology which I see as fundamental for tackling the climate crisis. And I'm glad to see over the last 10 to 20 years, the kind of intellectual infrastructure around social science, climate social science, has grown a lot. Although that growth has tended to be in a rather anthropocentric manner. So there's always, my championing of sociology is partial because at the same time, I'm also reflectively critiquing sociology. So I've got parts in this book where I'm asking, the sociology of climate change, where are the animals in that? But sociology and the social sciences generally are known to look at social norms, the emergence of social norms, the stabilization of social norms, how social norms change. So we have those critical tools to think about habits, and routinized behavior, these kinds of things, which I think, it shouldn't take too much thinking to realize how that's important for required transitions. Sociology, not alone in this, but sociology obviously has an interest in power. And I don't think we can really tackle the climate crisis without understanding lots of different registers of power, be that in terms of gender, social class, geopolitics, post-colonial relations, and so on. And also, obviously, power between humans and other animals. Sociology also has a focus on social change. So this is one of the things that attracted me to the topic in terms of probably about 15 years ago when I was at Lancaster University, being influenced by people there, such as Professor Elizabeth Shove, who were developing a kind of practice theory approach to understanding how practices change and how that can be utilized in terms of sustainable transitions and this kind of thing. So sociology has a particular take on social change, which is quite different to psychological theories of behavior change, which tend, on the whole, to be quite individualistic. And practice theory interested me because it's trying to go beyond the dualism between individual and society and to come up with a truly sociological understanding of social change. So in the second half of the book, I spend quite a lot of time trying to operationalize that approach, that practice theory approach to understanding how meat cultures might change, how we might change away from cultures which obviously center the consumption of non-human animals. And then perhaps last but not least, sociology was built upon trying to understand the emergence of capitalism. I don't think we can understand the climate crisis without understanding the historical development of capitalism. Readers will note in the early parts of the book, I talk about the Capitalocene instead of the Anthropocene. I think it's a better conceptual tool for understanding the climate crisis. And so I'm influenced in terms of my work on capitalism. I suppose this is, again, where I'm not just being sort of championing sociology. I'm influenced by political theorists like Nancy Fraser and Rahel Yagi and environmental historian Jason Moore. He might also describe himself as a sociologist, but certainly they're non-animal studies people who I bring into the conversation, and I try to improve the idea of the Capitalocene by improving its sort of human-animal relations, its critical animal dimension in the early chapters of the book. So there's a few ways in which sociology comes into the book, but also, it's also an argument for interdisciplinarity, and it's also a reflexive critique of sociology at the very same time.
Oh, yes, I definitely felt that. I enjoyed a lot of the book as, philosophical work, as political work. It definitely wasn't just sociological. And I definitely picked up on the critique of other sociologists, which I welcomed. You picked up on many of the things I was going to ask about, which is really nice. That hopefully structures our conversation. Let's start with the last topic you were addressing, because that comes first in the book. That's the relationship or the differences between the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene. Could you explain, what these things are and why you think we're better off as critical animal studies scholars or as people worried about the climate crisis thinking about this in terms of the Capitalocene rather than the Anthropocene?
It concerns me when humanities scholars or social scientists kind of uncritically adopt the language of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene obviously is a very interesting idea in terms of it's got merits in the sense that it's pointing out the way in which, humanity, but that's also its problem because it kind of generalizes. It's sort of humanity has caused this new epoch to come into being, and obviously there is a sense in which that is true. Parts of humanity have acted in such a way that we are now affecting the weather, and we're affecting the climate. The Anthropocene was put forward by a couple of people that were like natural scientists, really, like different parts of natural science, be that geology or areas like that. And I think we really need to, again, to pick up on the previous point, have that interdisciplinary approach to understanding the climate crisis. So we need proper historical work, we need sociological work, we need political theory, we need philosophy in all those things. And those theorists who have been associated with alternative concepts to the Anthropocene, of which the Capitalocene perhaps is the most notable, have all had concerns about the way in which the Anthropocene as an idea doesn't really have an historical theory of how we got to where we are. And also the kind of the generalized anthropos is highly problematic from a political perspective, because it's talking about a generalized human and a generalized we, when I think we need to unpack that and realize that there are privileged parts of humanity that bear more responsibility for instigating the climate crisis. And so we need some awareness of social class in the Anthropocene, and that's something that the Capitalocene does. And I guess the main theorist that I draw upon of the Capitalocene is certainly Jason Moore, and he's quite good on also understanding the history of patriarchal change. He's very influenced by people like Maria Mies. He's rather good on the colonial context of the development of capitalism and how that links into the climate crisis too. And he's not bad on species as well. He's quite, at times in his work, he's not a critical animal scholar, but he certainly does understand that the emergence and the development of capitalism has very much also been underpinned by the commodification of the more than human and also non-human animals. It's just that I don't think he quite goes far enough on that. And so I'm trying to really extend that critique of anthropocentrism within capitalist theory. So it's a bringing together of critical animal scholarship with capitalist scholarship in those first couple of chapters, which I think is important because it kind of sets the scene for a properly intersectional understanding of the climate crisis, and one which is in a sense post-human. It's not a kind of humanistic intersectionality. It's an understanding of intersectionality that includes the more than human.
One of the features of the intersectional approach you're taking, which I found really interesting, was the choice to focus a whole chapter, I think it was chapter 5, on children. Why do you think it's important to discuss children as part of this conversation?
It really came to me unexpectedly because when I started working at Edge Hill University 10 years ago, I was asked to start teaching a module on childhood studies. And so that kind of, I've never taught on the sociology of childhood before, and exposed me to a lot of interesting work. And it really began to dovetail quite nicely with my interest in climate in unexpected ways. So children are another marginalized group, and we need to include age within our understanding of intersectionality. We can't just do the usual gender, race, class, and species and so on. We do need to think about age, and we do live in a very adult dominated world where children's voices are marginalized. And also, I argue in the book that the kind of myth of childhood innocence, which has been criticized by a lot of childhood studies scholars for other reasons, acts to protect children from an understanding of things like animal agriculture, but also from the climate crisis as well. So we tend to think, well, children should be protected from understanding the violent aspects of social reality, of which the slaughterhouse is, and also, be protected from knowledge which might communicate to them that their future is in peril, which it is in terms of the climate crisis. So I guess I expand the critique of childhood innocence mythology found within childhood studies to apply it to human-animal relations, and to join with the critique that there are some childhood studies scholars that have done interesting work around climate change and have argued that in terms of adequate environmental education or climate education, one of the justifications for not having that on the curriculum is that, it's too political, or it's exposing children to too much reality, as we might say. One answer to that, it's all very well having the kind of critique. Well, what do we do next? Well, we need to kind of democratize child-adult relations. We need to an extent, politicize childhood. We need to give children a voice. We need to have age-appropriate discussions with all children of all ages around the climate crisis. We need adequate climate education, and that climate education should include critical animal pedagogy, which is another interesting development. If your listeners aren't aware of critical animal pedagogy, it's essentially the argument that critical work on human-animal relations should be part of the curriculum. It should be part of what children engage with as part of the curriculum. That CAP, critical animal pedagogy, should be a part of climate education precisely for those reasons that I outlined earlier of where human-animal relations exist within the whole climate crisis debate, i.e. in the emergence of the climate crisis, in the impacts of the climate crisis, and in the potential strategies for addressing the climate crisis.
This is all music to my ears, and I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying, but I can imagine defenders of animal exploitation getting very nervous about this conversation. I can almost hear them saying that you're advocating vegan indoctrination of children. Is that a charge that worries you?
Not at all. We live at the moment in a time of indoctrination, of generational universalism, the way in which we socialize children into the norm of anthropocentrism. So this critical animal pedagogy is exactly the antidote to that particular ideological way in which we ideologically shape children's ways of thinking. This is a more it's a democratic intervention in a sense, because this is about giving children the ability to think critically about how we relate to other species. And, we're not just in a climate crisis, we're also in a biodiversity crisis. And I address that in the book as well. We can't separate the biodiversity crisis from the climate crisis. And, this is the point in history that we need people generally, but children specifically, to have critical tools around human-animal relations. And I don't care about people who have particular ideological and economic investments in the meat industry and so on, because I think they're on the wrong side of history.
I want to return to practice theory, which you mentioned earlier. Chapter 7 contains some really quite detailed descriptions of what we could be doing as activists. And this, of course, really speaks to the critical animal studies background, which pushes us to think about the connection between our academic work or our lives as academics and our lives as activists or politically engaged citizens. So could you introduce us to practice theory, which I confess is not something I've really come across before, and explain how it helps us to challenge animal exploitation and challenge the climate crisis?
Okay, I'll try and distill that down. I'm gonna miss some detail because it's quite a complicated framework. I will say a few things about it for sure. So from a practice theory approach, it's a post-humanist approach in the sense it's decentering the human. So think about standard psychological theories of behavior change. We'll say things like, as activists or even as academics, we'll say we need to challenge the attitudes of people on a particular topic. We need to change those attitudes so we can change the behavior of those people, and we can thus arrive at a more sustainable future and so on. So practice theory rejects that kind of language and decenters the human. It has no interest in attitudes. It would actually ontologically contest the idea that there is such a thing as an attitude. And so the human is not the unit of analysis within practice theory. The social practice is the unit of analysis in practice theory. So it's not about changing attitudes, it's about changing practices. And practices interlink with other practices and they form bundles and infrastructures of other practices. It's an approach which is trying to have what's called a flat ontology. So it's trying to move beyond this kind of scaled representation of society as individual and structure. It's trying to kind of flatten that out and just appreciate the way in which the social world is comprised of practices. Each particular practice is comprised of three elements. These are the materialities involved in any practice, the competencies involved in order to do a practice, and the meanings of a practice. So for practice theory, particular ways of doing, particular habits become dominant within society when they successfully enroll people into the practice. So it becomes an exercise in thinking, well, what is it about the three elements of a practice, the meanings, the materialities of a practice, and the competencies of a practice that link together well and allow that practice to become socially dominant? And what is it that links one practice to another, which again is important. So in terms of thinking about plant-based transition, it then becomes an exercise in deconstructing what the different practices are involved in terms of, well, let's just focus here on eating. So what are the meanings of different foods? What are the materialities of eating? And what are the kind of competencies, skills involved in terms of achieving a particular practice of eating? And how can those elements be intervened into in order to make the enrollment of people into animal source food consumption less likely, and B, the enrollment of people into plant-based eating more likely? That is a simplified outline of practice theory, and there's obviously much more detailed discussion and outline, and hopefully in an accessible way within the book. It's an influential framework generally, so people such as I mentioned, Rahel Yaegi, she's interested in constructing a practice understanding of capitalism. And so one thing I'm doing in the book is related to that, because I'm trying to construct a practice understanding of the animal industrial complex, which I see as one important facet of the emergence of capitalism and obviously capitalism as it exists today as well.
That's really helpful. I was also really interested in how we can do, if you like, practice theory in practice. I remember you had a list of possible interventions at the end of chapter 7 that you said, based on practice theory, could be really influential in helping with a plant-based transition.
Of all the three elements of a practice, when it comes to food, meanings are particularly important, because I just think there's cultural meanings around food for some reason because it's such, I guess, like an intimate part of what we do every day. It's also very, deeply culturally constructed. It's not like a complete reinvention of what activists and academics are already talking about. So it would be things like intervening into the gendered nature of food, and sort of intervening into the way in which meat is associated with masculinity and that kind of thing. And so a lot of the work that's already being done is contesting those dominant food meanings. And so we can read that back into practice theory and understand how that is already happening, but maybe we can gain some new insights in terms of understanding how different practices work together, and maybe something about connections between different practices might be important. So in another bit of my work, which I kind of include in the book, I'm particularly interested in the kind of material work of vegans, and how the creative work of vegans around food actually has helped the popularization of veganism. So if you think about, if you're part of the vegan community, maybe not all listeners are. So if you delve into the vegan community and the food culture of vegans, you will find so much creativity in terms of reinventing food, like reinventing meat dishes from a particular culture, veganizing them, and so on. So there's that kind of creativity with the materiality of food, which is also simultaneously bringing in new competencies and also producing at the same time new food meanings as well. So it's like we don't have to give up our food culture via plant-based transition. We can just tweak it in creative ways, and it's not some kind of dour foodscape where we're all eating lentils. Veganism, for example, is a very expansive diet. It's not a restrictive diet at all. Those are the sorts of interventions that I have done research on. But as you say, at the end of that chapter 7, I've got a whole table of potential interventions that could be done, which sort of inspired by that practice theory way of thinking.
This is a topic so close to my heart. I feel we could talk about it for hours and hours, but I'm aware that time's ticking on. Now, Richard, given that you're a returning guest, we have 4 quick questions rather than our usual 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
Certainly am, thank you. Yeah, let's hear them.
What's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of conducting animal studies research?
I think the critical animal field is historically relevant. It's historically pertinent. We're doing things that have, that have really never been done before. There's never been, and I don't mean to kind of antagonize or marginalize people who are just new to animal studies and maybe haven't kind of politicized their own practices. But in terms of thinking like critical animal scholars, it's the first academic community in history which is essentially embodying vegan values and vegan practices as part of their scholarship. And I think, that is historically significant. So it's quite rewarding to be part of that, and also to make links, and not to be, there's this kind of sense in academia that we shouldn't tarnish our scholarship, but by association with activism. But we can't just do this work and not realize the urgency of social change. So links to activism is also another really sort of rewarding aspect. And I'll go to lots of different types of conferences. I'll go to purely academic conferences, then I'll go to conferences which certainly include lots of activists. And it's really rewarding to meet people who are doing things in an imaginative way and that are instigating change. So I think meeting people in the community is like just a really rewarding part of being part of the field. But also that kind of the feeling that that you're making history. And when one of the leading philosophers of the 20th century, Jacques Derrida, realized that the question of the animal, the question of human-animal relations, was so central to his work and central to philosophy, and I'm not just saying that we need to kind of have the words of a white male philosopher to kind of justify what we're doing. Lots of other work by lots of other people that was doing this at the same time. But to have such a major philosopher say that was significant for me, and it kind of really emphasized that this is historically important work, and it's an historically important intervention into Western modernity.
And on the flip side, what's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of conducting animal studies research?
okay, it's the slow pace of change. That's an easy one to answer. If I think about not really seeing mainstream disciplines which should be changing, sociology should really be further down the road of being shaped by post-humanist and critical animal thinking. It's not there yet, and we could probably certainly say the same about mainstream British philosophy and other disciplines as well. So we don't see that academic change, and we also don't see the change that we need in the wider culture and the wider global culture in terms of the urgency of climate crisis and the urgency of trying to contest the commodification of non-human animals. So we're living in really urgent times, and we're not rising to that urgency at all.
Can you think of an animal studies scholar that you'd like to make listeners aware of? So this could be an emerging scholar, someone who's written in the field but who hasn't received the attention that they deserve, someone who writes in non-standard academic formats, just somebody who you think our listeners should be paying attention to but perhaps aren't.
I will mention Paula Arcari, who is a former colleague of mine. She's currently living in Australia and she's still publishing. She's got a book coming out next week. She's edited on the concept of heterotopias. It's a book about animal liberation. She was kind enough to ask me to write one of the forewords for that book. I think she's a great person to champion because her work is really focused on how to achieve social change for human-animal relations, for non-human animals. And yeah, definitely read Paula Arcari's work.
And this final question is entirely relevant to the book we've been discussing today. Are you optimistic about the future of human-non-human animal relations?
That's another really good question. So I think if somebody answers that question in the affirmative, we got to sort of question, are you in touch with reality if you're just giving this kind of really rosy, optimistic answer? So ideas of hope, optimism, and pessimism are kind of present in the book. And I've got this conclusion chapter, which I gave this, it's supposed to be a slightly tongue-in-cheek title, and I call the concluding chapter in the book, Unearthing Hope from Real Pessimism in the Alliances Yet to Be. That's my way of saying that it's irresponsible to be optimistic at this point in time, because that is really just not in touch with reality. And, this book was written before Trump got reelected. That just brings it home even more. If we want to find optimism, we need to make it, and we need to make it in the sense of networks and alliances which do not exist yet. Okay, so the hope is a possibility, optimism is a possibility, but it also is something that has to be struggled for. It's not something that we can just skip down the road and pretend everything's all great, because it certainly isn't.
What are you working on next?
I've just published some work which looks at something called the Dublin Declaration, which was an attempt, I interpret it as an attempt by the international meat sciences to try to protect the animal industries and to argue against the need for plant-based transition. So I've done some solo and some collaborative work around the Dublin Declaration, which I think is really worthwhile. And the claims that the Dublin Declaration were making, I don't think they were evidence-based. I'm also doing work on vegan running. I've been a runner for about 15 years and a member of Vegan Runners, which is a UK running club. And I think the biggest running club in the UK, interestingly, measured by park run attendance, which is that weekly 5K run that people might be familiar with. And so I'm interested in understanding how and why people become vegan runners, and whether that can be a model for sustainable citizenship and also for public health benefits as well. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to do research on, and hopefully I'll be doing more on that in the future. Apart from that, I'm not sure. We'll see. I've had quite a busy few years, so I'm pausing and thinking about new directions to take.
How can people find out more about your work?
I'm on social media. I'm still on Twitter, but I'm probably migrating to Blue Sky, is it? But I'm kind of doing like a phased transition. I have a website, just my name, richardtwine.com. So that's got like my publications and things like that. And, I supervise PhD students as well. So that's, if anybody's listening who's at that stage where they might be interested in doing that, then you can get in touch with me.
Well, thanks so much, Richard, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook, and we're at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher, and I'm on Blue Sky. And please do spread the word about Knowing Animals. For example, if you're teaching this year, please put it on your reading list so students can tune in too. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.